Hans Island, Arctic Ocean, July 1984. A helicopter approaches a barren, rocky outcrop halfway between Canada and Greenland. The island is tiny, just half a square mile of frozen, uninhabited rock. Canadian soldiers jump out. They plant the Canadian flag in the permafrost. They erect a sign, "Welcome to Canada." And then they leave something behind, a bottle of Canadian Club whiskey. Within weeks, Denmark responds. Their Minister of Greenland Affairs flies to the island, removes the Canadian flag, raises the Danish flag, and leaves his own gift, a bottle of schnapps and a note reading, "Welcome to the Danish Island." This is how the Whisky War begins. Not with weapons, not with violence, with flags and bottles of alcohol. For the next 38 years, Canada and Denmark waged the world's friendliest conflict, a war fought entirely with whiskey, schnapps, and diplomatic passive aggression. In June 2022, the war finally ends, not with surrender but with compromise. The two countries agree to split the island, creating the world's longest maritime boundary and giving Canada its first land border with Europe. This is the story of Hans Island, the dispute that lasted nearly 50 years, and how two NATO allies proved that even territorial conflicts can be resolved with humor and diplomacy. The island nobody wanted until they did. Hans Island, called Tartupaluk in Inuktitut and Greenlandic, is spectacularly unimpressive. It's 0.5 square miles of barren rock. No trees, no vegetation, no resources, no strategic value. Nothing but stone, ice, and harsh Arctic wind. The island has been part of Inuit hunting grounds since at least the 14th century. Greenlandic Inuit would cross the Kennedy Channel to hunt seals and polar bears. But nobody lived there permanently. The terrain is too hostile. When European explorers mapped the Arctic in the 1800s, Hans Island barely registered. It was surveyed during various expeditions, British, American, Danish, but nobody cared about ownership. It was just another rock in a sea of rocks. That changed in 1973. Canada and Denmark decided to establish a maritime boundary through the Nares Strait, the narrow waterway between Ellesmere Island, Canada, and Greenland, Denmark. They negotiated for months, drawing lines on maps, defining zones of control. And they hit a problem. Hans Island sits exactly in the middle of the channel, equidistant from both shores. According to international maritime law, countries can claim territories up to 12 nautical miles from their coast. Hans Island falls within the 12-mile limit for both Canada and Denmark. The negotiators did what diplomats do when facing unsolvable problems. They punted. The 1973 treaty deliberately left the border undefined across Hans Island. They agreed on everything else, point 122 and point 123 on either side of the island, but drew no line connecting them. The Hans Island question would be resolved at a later date. That later date wouldn't come for nearly 50 years. The war begins, 1984. For 11 years after the 1973 treaty, nobody bothered with Hans Island. Then in 1983, a Canadian oil company surveyed the area. A Greenlandic journalist noticed and wrote an article. The article sparked protests in Greenland. Danes were outraged that Canadians were operating on Danish territory. The Danish government felt pressure to act. In 1984, Denmark's Minister of Greenland Affairs, Tom Høyem, flew by helicopter to Hans Island. He planted the Danish flag, left a bottle of schnapps, and deposited a note. "Welcome to the Danish Island." Canada wasn't about to let that stand. Canadian troops soon arrived, removed the Danish flag, planted the Canadian flag, and left a bottle of Canadian Club whiskey along with their own note, "Welcome to Canada." The Whisky War had officially begun. The conflict gained its name when Canadian soldiers planted their national flag on Hans Island and left a bottle of Canadian whiskey. Shortly afterward, the Danish Minister of Greenland Affairs visited the island, raised the Danish flag, left a bottle of schnapps, and a note welcoming visitors to the Danish island. For the next 2 decades, the tradition continued. Every few months or years, one country would send troops or officials to the island. They'd remove the rival flag, plant their own, and leave alcohol. Canadian whiskey from Canada, Danish schnapps, specifically Gammel Dansk from Denmark. The two countries maintained a sense of humor in the dispute. As Peter Taxo Jensen, a Danish official, explained, "When Danish military go there, they leave a bottle of schnapps, and when Canadian military forces come there, they leave a bottle of Canadian Club and a sign saying, 'Welcome to Canada.'" It was alternately described as one of the most passive-aggressive boundary disputes in history and the friendliest war. Escalation. Sort of. Despite the light-hearted alcohol exchanges, both countries took the dispute seriously. Sovereignty matters, even over worthless rocks. In 2005, things almost got tense. On July 13th, Canadian soldiers visited Hans Island again. They erected an Inuksuk, a traditional Inuit stone marker. They planted another Canadian flag, and this time, Canadian Defense Minister Bill Graham personally landed on the island. Denmark filed a formal diplomatic complaint. "We consider Hans Island to be part of Danish territory, and will therefore hand over a complaint about the Canadian minister's unannounced visit," Danish officials stated. The escalation made headlines worldwide. But even then, nobody was talking about actual conflict. The Danish and Canadian militaries occasionally sent troops to the island, raised flags, and left bottles of liquor. That was the extent of hostilities. The dispute even spawned a Google war in 2005. A Canadian author saw a Google advertisement claiming Hans Island belonged to Denmark, linking to the Danish Foreign Ministry. He bought his own ad stating the island belonged to Canada, with a link to a page featuring a rotating Canadian flag and the Canadian national anthem. The Canadian Foreign Affairs Ministry responded diplomatically. As a goodwill gesture to Denmark, they would still allow Danish pastries to be sold in the ministry cafeteria. This was the level of hostility the Whisky War produced, competing Google ads and jokes about pastries. Why it mattered. Hans Island is worthless. Everyone acknowledges this. It has no resources, no strategic value. You can't live there. You can't farm there. It's just rock. So why did Canada and Denmark care? Several reasons. First, sovereignty. In international law, unclaimed territories can become problems. If Canada and Denmark both ignored Hans Island, another country might try to claim it. Better to settle the question definitively. Second, precedent. Both countries have extensive Arctic territories. How they handle Hans Island sets precedent for future disputes. If Canada concedes Hans Island, it might weaken claims elsewhere. Same for Denmark. Third, Arctic warming. Climate change is melting Arctic ice, opening new shipping routes and making resources accessible. What's worthless today might be valuable tomorrow. The Northwest Passage, the Arctic sea route connecting Atlantic and Pacific, runs near Hans Island. And fourth, maritime boundaries. The 1973 treaty settled most maritime boundaries, but left gaps. Resolving Hans Island would help finalize the entire boundary system. But most importantly, both countries are NATO allies, close friends, democratic partners. They couldn't let a tiny territorial dispute damage that relationship. But they also couldn't just give up their claim. So they fought the friendliest war in history, a war with no casualties, no battles, no violence, just flags, alcohol, and passive-aggressive notes. The path to peace, 2005 to 2022. By 2005, both nations acknowledged they needed a permanent solution. Climate change was accelerating. Arctic sovereignty was becoming more important. The joke was getting old. Canada and Denmark agreed on a process to resolve the dispute. They formed working groups, held meetings, negotiated quietly while continuing the flag and whiskey tradition. In May 2018, the two countries established a joint task force to determine the boundary between Canada and Greenland, including Hans Island. Critically, they included Inuit representatives from Nunavut. According to the Nunavut Land Claims Agreement, Inuit must be included in negotiations affecting their traditional territories. The negotiations lasted 4 years. Both sides wanted a fair solution that respected indigenous rights and international law. On June 11, 2022, Denmark, Greenland, Canada, and Nunavut reached agreement. Hans Island would be divided along a natural ridge running through its center. Denmark would receive roughly 60% of the island. Canada would get the remaining 40%. The agreement also settled disputed maritime boundaries in the Lincoln Sea and Labrador Sea, creating a 962-kilometer maritime boundary, the longest in the world. On June 14, 2022, the treaty was signed in Ottawa at the headquarters of the Royal Canadian Geographical Society. Canadian Foreign Minister Melanie Joly, Danish Foreign Minister Jeppe Kofod, and Greenlandic Prime Minister Mut Borupagede signed the historic agreement. And they exchanged one final bottle. Joly presented Canadian maple whiskey, Sortilege. Kofod presented Gameldansk, bitter. The Whisky War ended the way it began, with alcohol. The message, 2022. The timing of the Hans Island resolution wasn't accidental. The treaty was signed just 4 months after Russia invaded Ukraine, a violent territorial conflict happening simultaneously with peaceful Arctic negotiations. Both Joly and Kofod explicitly contrasted the two situations. We see a gross violation of international rules unfolding in another part of the world, Kofod said. May this agreement inspire other countries to follow the same path. Joly stressed, the Arctic must remain a low-tension region. We cannot fall into the trap of militarizing the Arctic. The message was clear. Territorial disputes don't require violence. International disagreements can be resolved through diplomacy, negotiation, and good humor. Even when both sides have legitimate claims, compromise is possible. The Whisky War became a symbol of peaceful dispute resolution, a model for how nations should behave toward each other. The trivia bonus. The Hans Island resolution created something unexpected. Canada and Denmark now share a land border. Previously, Canada only bordered the United States. Denmark only bordered Germany. Now they share 1,280 meters of border running through Hans Island. Canada has a land border with Europe. Denmark has a land border with North America. This delighted trivia enthusiasts everywhere. At the signing ceremony, journalists joked about the implications. Could Canada now enter the Eurovision Song Contest? Was Canadian bacon now technically European? Joly quipped, that a Canadian singer would surely enter Eurovision next year. Kofod laughed. "Welcome, Canada, to the European continent." The Canadian bottle of schnapps that Kofod gave Jolie, it's going straight to the Museum of History, Jolie announced. Even the final resolution maintained the war's light-hearted spirit. What we lost and gained. The Whisky War is over. No more flag swapping, no more bottles of alcohol left on frozen rocks, no more passive-aggressive notes. In some ways, that's sad. The Whisky War was charming, a reminder that international relations don't have to be hostile, that disputes can be handled with humor. But what we gained is more important. Proof that diplomacy works, that even long-standing territorial disputes can be resolved peacefully, that NATO allies can disagree without destroying their relationship. The Danish Parliament ratified the agreement on December 19, 2023, formally ending the dispute. Hans Island now has a border running through it. Canadians and Danes can legally visit both sides. The conflict that lasted 49 years is over, resolved not through violence, but through negotiation, compromise, and a few dozen bottles of whiskey and schnapps. The final toast. So here's what happened. In 1973, Canada and Denmark couldn't agree who owned Hans Island. In 1984, they started a war, fought with flags and alcohol. For 38 years, they took turns claiming the island, each visit leaving bottles of national liquor for the other side. In 2022, they agreed to share it. Denmark got 60%, Canada got 40%. They signed the treaty, exchanged final bottles, and ended the world's friendliest war. No casualties, no battles, no violence, just whiskey, schnapps, and two countries proving that even territorial disputes can be handled with class. Next time you hear about a border conflict, remember Hans Island. Remember that countries can disagree without fighting, that sovereignty disputes don't require tanks. Sometimes all you need is a flag, a bottle of booze, and a sense of humor. Cheers to that,